This is 1860. America is on the verge of a conflict that can alter the course of history. The consequences of this conflict will decide whether America will be the United States of America or the divided states of America. The root of this conflict goes decades back when the North and South went on different paths related to social and economic structures. The North industrialized itself to support its economy and became more urban. Due to industrialization, they were not reliant on slaves to run their economy and had developed anti-slavery sentiments. They were against the expansion of slavery in new territories. In contrast, the South focused heavily on agriculture, the economy which was based on slave labor, particularly in the cotton industry. Unfortunately, developments like the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, made slavery even more profitable in the southern states where cotton became king. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new states would allow slavery became increasingly divisive. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance between free and slave states. The debate over states' rights versus federal power also surfaced. The South feared that the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery altogether. Southern states argued for their right to maintain slavery. Northern states believed that the federal government had ultimate authority over states. This led to the nullification crisis of the 1830s, when South Carolina, led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, argued that states had the right to nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. The crisis was temporarily resolved by the Compromise Tariff of 1833. Disputes arose again when the U.S. gained new territories after the Mexican-American War. Northerners wanted these new areas to remain free from slavery, so Wilmot Proviso was proposed in Congress, but the Senate was equally divided between free states and slave states, and it could not muster the majority necessary for approval. The Compromise of 1850 was a major attempt to ease these growing tensions. In this compromise, California was admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were allowed to decide for themselves, via popular sovereignty, whether to permit slavery. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C. A stricter Fugitive Slave Act was also part of this compromise, which required the North to return escaped slaves to the South. Federal marshals could be fined if they did not arrest alleged escaped slaves. Citizens who aided escaped slaves could be punished with heavy fines and imprisonment. Captured individuals had no right to a jury trial, and even free African Americans could be falsely accused and sent into slavery. This law angered many Northerners and inflamed abolitionist sentiment, as it forced them to participate in the institution of slavery, directly and indirectly. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which allowed settlers to decide whether their territories would allow slavery. This act led to violent confrontations, which is known as Bleeding Kansas. Then the Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be U.S. citizens, and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in U.S. territories. This further fueled the anti-slavery sentiments and led to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. John Brown was convinced that an armed insurrection was necessary to end slavery in the United States. He raided the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, where he planned to distribute the arms to enslaved people and abolitionist allies. Within 48 hours, federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee captured and killed Brown's men. Brown himself was wounded and taken prisoner. Brown's famous words before his execution were, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." This raid on one side motivated the northern states to rise against slavery, and on the other side confirmed the worst fears of southern states. The crux of the matter is by 1860, the country was deeply divided over slavery. 1860 was the year of the presidential elections. It was the first time in the history of the United States that there were four major candidates for the presidency: Abraham Lincoln, representing the Republican Party; Stephen A. Douglas, representing the Northern Democratic Party; John C. Breckinridge, representing the Southern Democratic Party; and John Bell, representing the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln was against the further expansion of slavery into new territories. He never mentioned the abolition of slavery from the root. Douglas supported popular sovereignty, where territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The Lincoln-Douglas debate of 1858 had made Lincoln a national figure due to his anti-expansion stance on slavery. Breckinridge was a pro-slavery anti-slavery candidate, advocating for the protection of slavery in all territories. Bell was focused on preserving the Union and avoided taking a firm stance on slavery. Presidential elections took place on Tuesday, November 6, 1860. The results were largely known soon after the elections, but the Electoral College voted on December 5, 1860. Lincoln got 1.8 million popular votes and 180 electoral votes. Douglas got 1.3 million popular votes and 12 electoral votes. Breckinridge got 800,000 popular votes and 72 electoral votes. Bell got 500,000 popular votes and 39 electoral votes. Lincoln won the election despite receiving less than 40% of the popular vote because he had 180 electoral votes. After the unofficial announcement of Lincoln's presidency on December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first to secede from the Union. In February 1861, Lincoln began his journey from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. As he traveled, the political situation worsened. By the time he reached Philadelphia, there were rumors of an assassination plot against him. To avoid danger, Lincoln changed his travel route and secretly entered the capital. By February 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. This marked the formal separation of the South from the United States. Their constitution was largely based on the U.S. Constitution, but explicitly protected slavery and state sovereignty. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated as president. In his inaugural address, Lincoln stressed that the Union was unbreakable. He assured that he had no plans to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he made it clear that secession was not an option. He left the decision of war or peace in the hands of the Southern states, stating, "You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors." 2 days after Lincoln's inauguration, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called for 100,000 volunteers to defend the Confederacy. Meanwhile, states like North Carolina, Virginia, and Texas debated secession. Even after the secession of South Carolina, the federal forts in the harbor, including Fort Sumter, remained under U.S. control. The Confederacy began seizing federal forts, arsenals, and other properties within its borders. But Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, remained under Union control. The Confederacy demanded the surrender of Union forces stationed at Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson, the Union officer in charge of the fort, refused, but his troops were running low on supplies. President Abraham Lincoln was faced with a difficult decision: either abandon the fort to avoid conflict or resupply it and risk provoking a military response. Lincoln chose to attempt a peaceful resupply mission, making it clear to the Confederate government that the supply ships carried food and provisions, not arms or reinforcements. However, Confederate leaders viewed this as an act of aggression. Negotiations between Union and Confederate officials failed, and on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces under the command of General Pierre Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. This marked the official start of the Civil War. The Civil War is a commonly accepted name for the conflict, but it was called different things by Americans immediately after it ended. The North often referred to it as the War of the Rebellion, while Southerners preferred the War of Southern Independence because it drew parallels to the American Revolution. A few Northerners called it the war to free the slaves, but this never gained much support since the South denied they were fighting to preserve slavery, and most Northerners didn't claim they were fighting to end it. Lincoln always referred to the conflict as an insurrection, as he never recognized the Confederacy as a legitimate government. The term Civil War has since become the neutral name for the conflict, avoiding any implication of specific causes or motivations.